At 52, she answered the bride ad no one would send. The farmer wept reading it. The letter came on a Tuesday, which is the only reason I remember it was a Tuesday at all. Otherwise, that whole stretch of winter ran together, gray light, cold mud, the same half-dozen rows of dead cornstalks I kept meaning to pull up and never did. The days had a way of ending before I'd noticed them properly starting. I had walked to the post office because my boot heel needed mending and Ardell's shop was 2 doors down, and I figured I might as well pick up whatever Clarence had for me while I was already in town, which was usually nothing. A catalog sometimes. Now and then a bill I already knew about. Clarence Pruitt had been postmaster in Gallatin since before I was born, and he had a face that never changed its expression regardless of what he was handing you, whether it was good news or a death notice or a busted pipe under the floor. It was all the same flat look under that same gray mustache, winter and summer both. So when he slid a proper letter across the counter, cream-colored envelope, written in a woman's hand, I thought it was a mistake for somebody else. There were 2 other Beckwiths in Gallatin at that time. One of them was a woman, and I figured it belonged to one of them. Clarence pointed at it without expression. "That's your name." Earl Thomas Beckwith, that was me. I looked at it another moment anyway, the way you look at something you want to be sure of before you believe it. I put the envelope in my coat pocket and didn't open it until I was back in the wagon. I don't know exactly why I waited. Maybe I was afraid of what it was, and maybe I was afraid of what it wasn't. I'd had enough disappointment that winter to be cautious about small things, and this felt like it might become one of them. I climbed up onto the bench. The mare stood steady. The street of Gallatin was mostly empty at that hour. Ira Spingler's mule tied outside the feed store, a woman crossing from the dry goods with a covered basket, 2 boys doing something to each other's hats in the alley beside the bank. Normal things. I sat and watched them without seeing them, and I took the envelope out and I opened it. You want to know about the ad. I understand that. It wasn't something a man talks about easy, even now, even to people he trusts. I had placed it in early October, which was already late in the year to be placing anything of that kind. The paper was out of Marysville, and it ran a column 3 or 4 times a month for men seeking wives and women seeking husbands. Small notices, 50 words or less, sometimes signed with a full name, and sometimes with initials and a post office box. I had been reading that column for somewhere close to 2 years, before I finally allowed myself to admit to myself what I was doing, and why I kept opening the paper to that particular page. Clara had been gone 4 years by the time I sent that ad in. Cancer it was. Fast. 61 days from the first morning she said her back was giving her trouble, and she'd said it the way you say something minor, something that'll pass, and I had handed her the liniment and gone back out to the work because that's what you do when something is nothing. 61 days from that morning to the one where I dug the hole and put her in it under the elm at the north end of the property. 23 years of marriage, and then that hole in the ground, and the elm and my neighbor, Floyd McGraw, standing next to me saying something I don't remember. And there it was. I don't want to talk about the grief in that way people talk about grief. The whole shape of it laid out careful and explained. Everybody's got grief. It's not a rare thing. What I do want to say is that after a while grief becomes something else, something quieter and in some ways harder to live with than the grief itself, and that thing is just being alone. Alone in a house that still smells like someone else was in it not long ago, and having no one to tell about the frost coming in or the good news about the south yield or anything in particular. Nothing big. Just the small plain facts of a day and nowhere to put them. I told my neighbor Floyd about the fence coming down in the east pasture, and he said he was sorry to hear it, and that was the end of the conversation. I told my son Roy, who was living then up in Nebraska with his wife and their children, about the new drainage tiles in the south field, and he said that was good and asked if I needed help, and I said no. These are decent men. That isn't the right conversation to have with them, and we all know it without having to say so. So I thought about it for 2 years, reading that column without admitting I was reading it. And then one morning I sat down at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and I wrote the ad, because I had decided, finally, that a man who kept doing the same thing while waiting for a different result was a particular kind of fool, and I had been that fool long enough. 52 years old, widower. 180 acres outside Gallatin, Kansas, most of it good bottomland, some debt but not ruinous. No children still at home. Honest. Looking for a companion who was likewise, for a woman who had already lived some portion of her life and who wanted someone reliable to live the rest of it with. I wrote it plain because I couldn't write it any other way, and because I had decided long before that a man who starts performing at 52 deserves what he gets. I sent it to Marysville with $15 for 6 weeks. I waited. 1 week, 2, 3, nothing. Well, that's not quite right. One letter came from a woman in Nebraska who opened by saying she was seeking a man with no debt at all and closed by asking if I had any relatives in the state she might get in touch with. I didn't write back. The other weeks passed with nothing, and the 6 weeks ended, and I didn't renew. I had made my attempt, and it had come to what it came to. I told myself it was fine. I went back to work. I went back to the gray days and the mud and the dead cornstalks and the conversations with Floyd about fencing and with Roy about whether I needed help with things I didn't need help with. I fell back into the particular silence of a house built for two where one person was doing all the living. And then one morning sometime in December, I caught myself telling the mare about the news from the Spingler farm down the road, just talking to the horse while I did the evening feed, telling her all about it in a decent amount of detail, and I realized I was doing it because I had to tell someone, or the information was just going to stay inside me and accumulate until there wasn't room for anything else, and that I had crossed some line with myself that I hadn't meant to cross. I stood there in the barn with the feed bucket and the realization, and the mare looked at me with the same patient blank look she always gave me, and I heard myself laugh, which was a strange sound. So that was where I was when I sat in the wagon on the main street of Gallatin in February and opened the cream-colored envelope with the woman's handwriting on it. She had written it on 2 pages. Clean paper, good quality, the kind a woman who had run a business would use. She said her name was Ruth Harlan. She was from Concordia, which was 40 miles north of Gallatin. She said she was 52 years old and she did not apologize for that fact or explain it or put it in any kind of frame. Just the number, same as the number I'd put in my ad. She said she had been widowed 3 years. Her husband had been a hardware man, she said. Thomas Harlan, good with numbers and good with customers. Not always easy to live with, but honest and fair dealing. And she had loved him and still did in the way you love somebody you've known a long time. She said she had 2 grown sons, both of them married, both of them gone to their own lives in other places, which was how it was supposed to be and which she was at peace with. She said she had kept her husband's hardware store running after he died because it was the sensible thing to do. There was stock in the building and accounts on the books, and she knew how all of it worked, and she saw no reason to sell something valuable in a grief-panicked rush. So she had run it, and she had run it for 3 years, and in September she'd sold it to a man from Abilene for what she considered a fair price. Not generous, fair. And she had cleared out her accounts and her rooms above the store and moved herself into a rented house on a quieter street while she thought about what she was going to do next. She said she had been reading the paper since July. She said she had read my notice when it ran at the end of September, and she had set the paper down and gone back to whatever she was doing, and she had thought about it. This, she said plainly, just like that. She had thought about it for 2 weeks before she did anything at all. She was not a woman who moved fast on things she couldn't take back. And then she had sat down and written a letter, but she had also sat on the letter for another 4 weeks before she mailed it, because she wanted to be sure she was being sensible and not just lonely, and she thought there was a difference between the two things worth taking seriously. Then she wrote the thing I want to tell you about. The sentence I read twice sitting in that wagon, and again that night, and again the morning after. She said, "I thought your advertisement was honest, and I thought you sounded like a man who had worked hard at something his whole life, and who had learned how to be still with it. I thought you sounded like someone I might genuinely want to know, and I find at 52 that I don't have the luxury anymore of avoiding the things I might want, out of a fear of being thought foolish for wanting them." She said, "I am sorry this letter is late. I am sending it anyway. Late is better than never in my experience, and I have too little time left to spend it being afraid of a piece of paper." I folded the letter careful, put it back in the envelope, and I drove home, unharnessed the mare, fed her, pumped water for the morning, carried the letter inside, set it on the table, made coffee, sat down across from it and looked at it a moment. Then I took it out and read it again from the beginning. Then I put my face in my hands at that table, and I wept. Not for sorrow. I know what weeping from sorrow feels like, and this was not it. I'd done plenty of that kind in the 4 years since the elm. This was something different in the chest, a loosening of something that had been pulled tight long enough I'd stopped noticing how much it was pulling. Relief, maybe, is the word for part of it, and something else I don't have a clean word for, which is the sensation of being taken seriously by a stranger when you have more or less stopped expecting it. Of someone looking at what you put down on paper and saying, "I see that. I think you might be worth knowing." I sat at that table a good while. The coffee went cold. Outside the kitchen window the field sat dark and quiet under the February sky, and the elm stood where it always stood, a black shape against the black, and I let it all settle. Then I washed my face at the basin, dried it on the kitchen towel, sat back down, and I wrote back. We wrote letters for 9 weeks. Hers came every Tuesday, reliably, which told me something about her without her ever saying it. You learn things about a person from where they put the reliable. She wrote, "I found out later, on Sunday evenings after supper, which was when she was most herself." She said, when the week was done and the obligations were cleared and she could think without something else making noise. She wrote the way she talked. I found out later that was true. Straight lines, no circling. She had opinions and she put them down without apology and then moved on to the next thing. She also had a dry sense of humor that came sideways at you, quiet enough you almost missed it, tucked in next to a factual statement in a way that you'd get 3 sentences later when it opened up. I caught myself laughing at the kitchen table more than once, actually laughing, out loud, alone, at something Ruth Harlan had written, and it was a strange enough sensation each time that I sat with it a moment before going on, just to be sure I was doing it right. She asked about the farm in specifics. Not the kind of nice general questions people ask when they're making conversation. She wanted to know the soil type, the drainage situation, what the yield per acre had looked like in a good year and in a bad one. Had I tried clover rotation? What my debt picture looked like and what it was tied to. She'd grown up on a farm before her family moved to Concordia when she was 14, and she married into town life. And she said she had kept the farm information she'd grown up with the way you keep information you think you might need again someday, without quite knowing when. I answered her honestly on all of it, including the debt, which was 2 notes I was servicing steadily and would be clear of in 4 years. I told her the south field number and the drainage problem in the east section, and what I thought the place could do with some capital improvements it didn't currently have. I told her about Clara. I told her about the elm. I figured if she was going to make a decision that was worth making, she was going to need the true version, not the one with the troublesome parts smoothed over. I told her other things too, smaller ones. I told her I wasn't much of a cook but had become adequate from necessity, that I was better at mornings than evenings, that I had a temper that I kept a reasonable hold on most of the time though not always, that I was a man who liked quiet more than company, which did not mean I didn't want company. It meant I was particular about the kind. That I had one friend I would call a real friend, which was Floyd McGraw from the neighboring property, and that I had several acquaintances I was cordial with, and that the difference between those two categories mattered to me. I think I was testing something, seeing whether the honest version of a man, not the ad version, not the best face version, was something she was still interested in once it was laid out whole. She wrote back and said, "I appreciate a man who knows the difference between a friend and an acquaintance. Most men I've known don't bother to make the distinction." She said she was the same way about quiet, that she'd lived above the store for 3 years and before that in a house with a husband and 2 boys, and she had liked her family, but she had also, she said, always needed a room in herself where she was alone, and she had never found that shameful. She wrote back about her husband. Thomas had been a good man with a stubborn streak, she said, and she had matched his stubborn with her own, and they had managed mostly. She said he worked himself to death at 61, not a way of speaking. She meant it literally. He had known something was wrong for more than a year before he told her, and by the time she knew he had about 4 months left. She said she had been angry about it for a solid year, at first at him for not telling her, and then at herself for being angry at a dead man, which she said was the most useless emotion she had ever experienced and also apparently unavoidable. She said, "At some point I gave myself permission to stop doing either one, and I just moved into what had to be done, which was the store and the accounts and the 2 grown boys who were also grieving and needed to see their mother intact. So I stayed intact." I thought about that sentence for a few days. Stayed intact. It was the kind of thing you only say that way if you know what the alternative feels like from the inside. In January, right at the end of a letter about something else entirely, she wrote and asked if I would like to meet. She said she would understand if I wasn't ready, and she'd understand if the idea of it didn't sit right, but that she was a woman who believed in finding out the facts directly when the facts could be found out, and the fact she was curious about was whether the man in these letters was the same as the man in person, since in her experience those were sometimes 2 different men. I wrote back and told her they were the same man. She wrote, "Good, I'll come on the 13th if that suits you." It suited me. I wrote and told her so. I cleaned the house. I'm going to say that plainly because it's the truth and there's no dignified version of it. I had let things go in the way a man alone lets things go, not to ruin, but to a reasonable male standard of livability that isn't necessarily what you want someone else to see. So I cleaned it, properly. I washed the windows, which had not been washed since Clara, and beat the rugs in the yard and scrubbed the kitchen floor on my hands and knees and got the wood stove surround clean. I made up the spare room with the good quilt, the one Clara's sister had made for our 5th anniversary and which I had been keeping in the cedar chest. The second morning after I cleaned, I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it and realized it looked like a house somebody had cleaned for company, which it did, because it was, and I decided I was either going to feel embarrassed about that or I was going to accept it as a reasonable thing a man might do and move on. I moved on. Ruth came by stage to Gallatin. She had written to say which one and I was there with the wagon. I had been trying to picture her for 9 weeks, and I had not managed it in any way that felt accurate. The handwriting gave me something, that forward-pressing straight-line quality, no hesitation in the strokes, but a face and a person I could not construct from it. So when she stepped down from the stage onto the plank walk in front of the depot, it was like a door opening into a room I had been trying to see through the wall. Medium height, brown traveling coat, dark hair with a good deal of gray through it, worn back simply in the way of a woman who isn't interested in maintaining a hairdo while she's working. Leather traveling bag that she carried herself, in her right hand, without apparent effort. She looked up and down the street of Gallatin with a direct and practical attention, the same look a person gives a new place when they're actually trying to understand it, not just waiting for their eyes to land somewhere. Then she found me and looked at me the same way. Not what I'd call a warm look, not cold either. Just a straight, accurate look, taking in information, deciding about it. She walked over. "Mr. Beckwith," she said. "Mrs. Harlan." We shook hands. She had a firm, dry handshake, which I had expected based on nothing except that it fit. We stood there on the plank walk with the shaken hands between us for a moment. Two people who had been writing each other for 9 weeks now meeting for the first time in front of a stage depot in a small Kansas town. And for just a second, I didn't know what the right thing to do was. Then she looked past me at the street and said, "It's good land coming in." I could see it in the color of the fields. "It is," I said. I took her bag and we walked to the wagon, and I helped her up onto the bench and went around to my side and got up and gathered the reins. And she had already turned to look at the street behind us as we pulled away, taking inventory. I drove. Neither of us felt any urgency to fill the air with words. She stayed 4 days. She slept in the spare room, and we conducted ourselves in a manner that Clara's mother, who had been a particularly upright Presbyterian woman from Missouri, would have found entirely proper. I mention this not because it requires defense, but because it was in fact the right way to do it, and we both knew that without discussing it. The first morning she came down the stairs before 6 o'clock. I heard her and I was already up and getting my coat on to go out and do the early chores. She was in the kitchen, and the coffee was already made. She'd found everything without asking, which meant she'd paid attention the night before, and she was at the table with a farm almanac I'd left there the previous fall, reading it. She looked up when I came to the kitchen doorway. "I made biscuits," she said. "They're in the cloth." She went back to the almanac. I put on my boots and went out and did the chores, and when I came back in and hung up my coat, the biscuits were in the cloth where she'd said they were, and they were good biscuits, made like she meant them, not light little tender things but real ones with substance, the kind that last through a morning's work. I ate 3 of them standing at the window looking out at the frost coming off the fields in the early light, and I did not say a single word about those biscuits to her, which was what they deserved. Some things you say nothing about and just eat. After the breakfast things were washed and put away, she asked if she could walk the property. "All of it," she said. We spent the better part of that afternoon walking it. She asked about the drainage tile in the south field and why the east fence had been let go the way it had. It was in poor condition and she didn't let that pass without asking about it. She noticed the elm immediately, the one at the north end. You couldn't miss it in February with everything else bare. It stood out in a particular way. She asked about it, and I told her about Clara. I told it plain. I didn't embellish it or dramatize it or make it into a story about me surviving something. I said who she was and how long we'd had and how she died and where I'd buried her. Ruth walked beside me through the north field while I said it, and she listened in a way that people don't always listen, without waiting for a place to insert something. When I was done, she said, 4 years isn't very long. Which was right. Not sorry for me, not hurrying past it, not trying to fix it. Just the accurate observation, said plainly. That was the right thing, and I knew it, and I think it was the moment something settled for me that I'd been uncertain about. We talked about her husband on the walk back. I asked her to tell me about him, and she did not a story about grief, but about him, what kind of man he had been, the way he handled accounts versus the way he handled customers, which were different skills, and he'd been uneven at both in certain respects. The stubbornness she mentioned in her letters, the good heart under the stubbornness. She talked about him the way you talk about someone who mattered honestly, without making him a saint and without making him a cautionary tale. Just who he was. I listened. That evening we sat on the porch after supper. It had gone cold in the way it goes in February when the air comes in clear from the northwest, the sky that particular color of dark blue that makes the stars look sharp and close, like something punched through tin. We had our coats on. We sat in the 2 chairs out there that Clara had made me put on the porch years ago because she said a porch without chairs was just a step, and we had our coffee, and neither of us talked for a good while, and it was not uncomfortable. That was the thing that told me something real about where this was going. Comfortable silence is not a common thing between two people who have known each other less than a day. It is either a sign of familiarity that has moved fast, which sometimes happens and is sometimes trustworthy, or it is a sign that two people are basically the same kind of quiet, which is rarer and steadier. I sat in that cold air and listened to the empty fields and the distant sound of something moving in the dark out past the barn, a deer, probably, or the neighbor's cattle come up to the fence. And Ruth Harlan sat in the other chair with her coffee and looked at the same sky I was looking at, and I thought, well, I had sat on that porch with Clara for years, and the silences had been easy silences. Different than this, because everything with Clara had been different. We'd grown into each other over decades. The way roots grow into ground, you don't notice it happening, and then one day you are woven through each other. This was not that. This was something newer and less settled. But the quality of the silence itself, the absence of the obligation to fill it, felt related to something real. I filed it where I filed things I wanted to think about later, and I finished my coffee, and we sat in the cold together until we both agreed, without saying so, that it was time to go in. I thought, this is what it is, and what it is good. The second day she came with me to do the regular morning rounds and asked more questions as we went, sharp ones about the operation, about what I was carrying into spring, and what I'd planned for the east section, and whether I'd thought about adding animals beyond what I was running. I told her what I'd been thinking, including the Mercer parcel to the east that I'd had my eye on, and she listened and asked what they were asking for it, and I told her, and she said that sounded a little high, and I said that was my feeling too. She said, "What would you offer?" I said what I'd offer, and she was quiet a minute and said, "I'd start there." That was the end of that conversation. 2 minutes, and we'd covered the thing and were done with it. That is also not a common thing. Most people talk a topic to death or talk around it without landing. She had a way of going straight to the center of a thing and saying the relevant portion and stopping. Third day she came with me on the feed run to town. I had business at the mill, and she waited in the wagon while I went in. And when I came back to start loading sacks, she had gotten down without being asked, and was already taking the near end of the first sack. We loaded them together, the two of us, and stacked them in the wagon bed, and there were a couple of men at the mill, old Pete Waverly and one of his boys, I think it was the youngest one, can't recall his name now, who watched her without saying anything, the way men do when a woman does something they categorized ahead of time as a thing women didn't do. She either didn't notice or didn't register it as worth her attention. Either way, she just kept loading. On the drive back she said, "You could run more land than this without trouble, if the drainage situation got resolved." "Been thinking about the Mercer parcel," I said. "How much land is it?" I told her. About 60 acres, most of it usable once you got the fence line sorted. "With your south field doing what you say it does," she said, "that's a reasonable addition." She thought a moment. "Have they had other offers?" "Not that I know of." "Then you have some time, don't hurry it." I looked at her. "You know farming." "I know land," she said. "It's different from knowing farming, but they overlap in the useful parts." We drove the rest of the way back mostly in the same comfortable quiet, and I thought about what it would be like to have those conversations on that seat with some regularity, and what I thought was that it would be a life worth living. The fourth morning was the last one. She was leaving after noon. I went out before 6 like always to do the early work, and the morning was cold and clear, one of those winter mornings where everything is absolutely still, no wind, the ground frozen hard, your breath going up in a white cloud with every step. I walked the fence line on the north end the way I sometimes did to think, or not to think. There's something in physical work along a fence line that settles things without having to work at them consciously. I was aware, walking it that morning, that there was someone in the spare room who was going to leave on the noon stage, and I had not yet found a way to say the thing that needed to be said, which is that I had liked all of this considerably and would like it to continue. When I came in from the morning chores, she had already made breakfast. Eggs, toast, the rest of the coffee. We ate at the kitchen table and talked about practical things. She had a question about the almanac and a prediction it made about the spring, which she was skeptical of, and I said I shared her skepticism, and we talked about that a few minutes. Ordinary. Easy. After the plates were washed and put away, she went upstairs and came back down with her traveling bag. She set it by the door. She put her coat on. She looked at me. She said, "I would like to come back, if you want me to." Just like that. No frame around it, no leading up to it, just the thing she meant. I said, "I want you to." She looked at me for a moment with those straight-line eyes, and I had the sense that she was finishing some calculation she had been running, some internal accounting of the 4 days and the 9 weeks of letters, and whatever she decided the whole sum came to. Then she stepped forward and she put her hand on my arm, just for a moment, just the pressure of her hand through the coat sleeve, warm and deliberate. She said, "Then I will." That was all of it, the whole of it right there. I drove her to the stage. We shook hands again, which by then was in fact slightly funny, and I think she thought so too because the corner of her mouth moved the way it moved when she was keeping something to herself. The stage pulled out, and I stood on the main street of Gallatin in the February cold and watched it until it rounded the corner south toward Concordia, and then I stood there a while longer with nothing to look at, and then I got in the wagon and drove home. I put the mare up. I walked into the kitchen. The breakfast things were washed and put away, and there was no evidence of her in the kitchen except her coffee cup sitting on the counter, upside down, the way you leave a cup when the house isn't your own, but you're not exactly a guest either. I didn't move that cup for 2 days. I'm saying that because it's true, and because I think you ought to know what kind of a state I was in, 2 days into a life that had turned into something I hadn't quite expected. She came back in March. She stayed a week. We walked the property again, and it had started to come up, the fields, that first pale green that appears before you're fully sure winter is done. And she stood at the edge of the south field and looked at it with her hands in her coat pockets, and she said, "It's a good farm, Earl," which was the first time she'd used my name out loud, just there at the end of a sentence about the field, almost as an afterthought, and I felt it in my chest the way you feel unexpected things. She had brought a crate of canning jars that she said she'd been keeping in her rented house in Concordia and had no further use for there. She moved them into the cellar herself, organized them on the shelf without instruction. She also brought a bread crock she said she didn't have room for. These were not gestures she made a thing out of. She brought things that were useful, and she put them where they'd be useful. I noticed this and didn't say much about it except "thank you," which she received without fuss. One afternoon it rained, a cold spring rain that kept us inside, and we sat in the front room and she read. She'd brought a book. She always brought a book, which I found out later was a fixed habit. She carried one everywhere. And I did the account books for the month, and the afternoon passed in that particular indoor rain quiet that is its own thing, thick and still, the sound of water in the yard and the work going on in the house. I finished the accounts and looked up, and she was still reading, and the lamp was on because the rain had made it gray, and the light was a warm circle around the chair, and I thought, this is a thing that could be an ordinary afternoon. This is a thing that could happen regularly, and I want it to. She went back to Concordia at the end of the week, and I drove her to the stage, and she said, "See you in May," as if it had already been decided, which I suppose it had been, and I said, "I'll be here," which also didn't need saying, but I said it anyway. She came back in May. The place was in full work by then, and she took to it like she'd been working alongside me for years. She had a practical competence that extended across everything. She could drive a nail as well as I could. She had useful opinions about the chicken situation, which I had been managing poorly for 2 years without fully admitting it, and she reorganized the root cellar in a way that made sense for the first time since I'd built it. She did all of this without making it a production, without pointing out what had been wrong before. Just fix things because they were fixable. The kind of person who sees a thing that needs doing and does it without requiring an audience for the doing. One morning in May she was up before me, which almost never happened. I am an early riser out of decades of habit, up before first light, and when I came downstairs, she was already in her coat and boots, and had taken the feed bucket out and done the chickens without asking whether that was something I wanted her to do. She was back in the kitchen when I came down and she said, "Chickens are done," in the same tone she used to say anything else, and I stood in the doorway a moment and thought about what kind of woman does the morning chickens at 5 o'clock because they needed doing and she was up, and the answer was, the kind of woman who'd run a hardware concern for 3 years on her own after her husband died, and found the whole operation still intact when she was done. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Coffee's fresh." We talked about the Mercer parcel again. I'd had a conversation with old Mercer's son who was handling the sale and come down to a number. Ruth thought it was fair. She said, "Take it." I took it. In the evenings we sat on the porch. We talked about things. We talked about her boys and my son Roy, and what was good, and what was hard about having grown children who were building their own lives far away. We talked about the farm and the plans and what the East Section could do with the right investment in it. We talked about Thomas and about Clara, not often, but when it came up naturally, we didn't steer away from it, which was the right way to be with things like that. Most evenings were just evenings. But when there was something to say, we said it. And the saying of it felt easy in the way things feel easy when you're doing them with the right person. In July she came and didn't leave. She had given up the rented house in Concordia at the end of June. She told me later she had made that decision in May, after the third visit, and had just not said so because she was still working through the practical details on her end. She arrived with 2 trunks, a box of books, a bread crock, and the particular wooden chair from her sitting room in Concordia that she said had been her reading chair for 15 years, and she wasn't leaving it behind. It was a good chair, as it turned out. It fit exactly in the corner of the front room the way she'd said it would, as if the corner had been waiting for it. I moved my own chair a few feet to the left to accommodate it. That was the right thing to do, and we both knew it without discussing it. She brought 2 trunks and a box of books and a particular wooden chair she said she couldn't be without, which turned out to be entirely true once it was in the corner of the front room. It was just the right chair for that corner, and I told her so, and she said she'd known it would be. We married in September. Justice of the Peace in Gallatin. Clarence Prout as one witness because he was already there when we came in to sign the license, which was his job, and which I think surprised him slightly even though he didn't show it. Frances Dobbs from the dry goods as the other witness. She'd come in to buy stamps and Clarence had simply asked her, and she'd said yes without hesitation, which was either an indication of her good nature or of how dull September afternoons were in Gallatin, probably both. Ruth wore a blue dress she'd had made in Concordia. Practical cut, good fabric, the kind of blue that doesn't make a fuss about itself. Not a ceremony dress. Something meant to last, to be worn again on decent occasions. She looked fine in it. She looked like herself in it, which is the same thing. I wore my good coat, the clean one. I had not told her I'd had it cleaned, but she noticed, and she didn't say anything about it, just the slight compression at the corner of her mouth. The ceremony itself was brief. Judge Harmon was a serious man who had presided over enough of these to have settled on the important parts and dropped the rest. He said what needed saying. We said what needed saying back to him and to each other. Ruth's voice was steady and direct, the way her letters were, the way she was in all things, and when she said "I do," she looked right at me the same way she'd looked at me the first time on the plank walk in front of the depot, taking in information, deciding about it, having already decided. I held her hand. She had a firm, dry handshake and she had warm hands, which I had not expected and which I noticed. We signed the register. Frances Dobbs signed as witness and shook our hands and said she was very pleased for us in a way that seemed entirely genuine, and Clarence signed as the other witness, and then he looked at us with his same face, the one that had not changed since I was old enough to go to the post office on my own, and he said, "You did all right, Earl." 30 years of knowing that man. That is what he gave me on my wedding day, and it was more than enough, and I thought Clara would have found it funny, and that Ruth would find it funny, and that I was going to take it for what it was, which was Clarence Pruitt's version of a standing ovation. Ruth was at my elbow and she looked at Clarence and then at me, and the corner of her mouth went in the way it went, and she kept it to herself until we were outside and walking to the wagon, and then she said quietly, "He seemed moved." I said, "That's as moved as he gets." She said I could tell. She laughed then, a real laugh, full and brief, the kind she let out when something landed exactly right. I laughed too, which made her laugh again, and we stood there beside the wagon on the main street of Gallatin in the September sun, just married, laughing about Clarence Pruitt's face, and I thought, there you are. There's what I wanted, that right there. I helped her up onto the bench. We drove home. And she got down from the wagon and started moving her things from where they'd been staged in the front hall, sorting what needed to go where. And I saw to the animals and came back in and found her in the kitchen working on supper, the last of the October light coming through the window at a low angle the way it does, the room smelling like onions and wood smoke, and the particular smell of that house that had been mine alone for 4 years now and was not any more. I hung up my coat. She said without turning around, "Sit down if you want. This'll be a few minutes." I sat down at the kitchen table. It was the same table where I'd read her letter in February, the one that had arrived too late to have been expected, from a woman who'd sent it anyway, because she decided late was better than never, and that she wasn't going to waste what time she had being afraid of a piece of paper. I sat at that table and looked at the back of Ruth Harlan, Ruth Beckwith now, standing at the stove in the kitchen of my house, in the last of the October light. We ate supper. We talked about the Mercer parcel, which had closed in early September and which I was already working on clearing the fence line. She had thoughts about the east section's first year, what to put in, what to wait on. I had thoughts too. We compared them. We disagreed on one point and talked it through, and ended up with a plan that incorporated both of our positions, which was a better plan than either one had started out. After the supper things were done, she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee in both hands, looking out at the yard in the last of the gray evening light. The way she stood there, the particular set of her shoulders, the way she held the cup, looking at that yard the way a person looks at something they've decided is theirs to look after. I was watching her from across the room, and she turned and saw me watching. She didn't make it into anything. She just looked back at me the way she looked at things, direct, taking in information, deciding about it. Then she said, "You want more coffee?" I said, "Sure." She poured it. She handed me the cup, and when she did, her hand covered mine for just a second, warm, and then she went back to the window. I stood there with the coffee. I looked at the same piece of yard she was looking at, the fence, the barn roof, the elm in the dark at the north end of the property, standing where it always stood. There are things you spend years not having that you can't quite name when you don't have them, and when they arrive you recognize them immediately, and what you think is, of course it's this. A kitchen in the evening with the work done. A woman who came 40 miles because she decided time was not unlimited and she wasn't going to waste it being afraid. Who went right to the center of things. Who helped load feed sacks without being asked and noticed the drainage tile and kept her own counsel and made biscuits like she meant them and put her hand on your arm to say the thing she meant with it and wrote a letter 6 weeks after anyone would have expected it because she decided late was better than never. Who looked at what you were and said, "I think that might be worth knowing." I stood at that table and looked at the elm in the dark and I thought, this is what it is, and it is good, and I know it and I will not forget it. The east fence went up in October, new posts and new wire, the two of us working it from opposite ends. The Mercer parcel we put into winter wheat. In December a hard freeze came and we worked the place through it the way you work a farm through a hard freeze, which is carefully and constantly. And one morning in the deepest of the cold, I was out doing the water pumps before first light, and I looked across the yard through the dark, and the lamplight was on in the kitchen. Just that. The lamp in the kitchen window. I stood there in the cold with the pump handle, and looked at it for a minute before I went back in. Ruth was at the stove. She didn't look up when I came in. She said, "Pump's probably frozen at the north end too." "I was just out there," I said. "It's all right." She said, "Good." She poured coffee. She handed it to me. I stood in the warm kitchen with it, and the cold coming off me in waves, and outside the window the dark fields sitting under the frost, with everything sleeping in them that would come up in the spring. Here I am, I thought, 52 years old, a man who put an ad in a paper that nobody answered for 6 weeks, and then a woman did. A woman who had decided that late was better than never and that she didn't have time anymore to be afraid of what she wanted. Here I am. That has always been enough. It is still enough. There are mornings I wake before her and lie there in the dark listening to the farm, the way a farm sounds before first light, the creak of it settling, the animals moving in the barn, the wind working itself into the eaves, and I think, I know what I have. I know the exact dimensions of it and the weight of it. That is not a small thing, knowing what you have while you have it. Most men I've known arrived at that knowledge only after something got taken from them, and they'd stand there holding the shape of the thing that was gone, trying to remember what it felt like to have it. I know that particular grief. I spent 4 years becoming an expert in it after Clara. What I am telling you is that I was given another chance at the other kind. The kind where you have the thing and know it at the same time, both together. That is rarer than it should be. I managed it, I know it. And I am telling you about it now because I think you ought to know that it's possible. That a man at 52 who is running out of easy excuses can place an ad that nobody answers and sit in a wagon on a February street in a small Kansas town with cold hands and a letter he almost left at the post office, and read 2 pages that change the whole shape of what comes next. She answered when nobody else would. She sat on that letter for 4 weeks and then she mailed it anyway because she had made up her mind that the time for talking herself out of things was over. She drove 40 miles on a stage in the middle of February to look at a man she'd only known from paper, and she looked at him straight, the way she looked at everything. She helped stack feed sacks. She asked about drainage tile. She came back in March. She came back in May. She brought her reading chair and her bread crock, and she came back for good, and she has been the steady, plain, good fact of my life ever since, and I have known it, and I do not forget it. She decided. Not because she had to, not because she had no other options, not because she was desperate or reckless or not thinking clearly. She decided because she was a practical woman who had looked at the situation and determined that this was the right thing to do, and Ruth Harlan, once she had determined a thing, did it. That is what I carry, that she decided, that she came and kept coming. That she poured that cup of coffee and covered my hand with hers for just a second in the kitchen of a house that is ours now, both of ours, in a life we built because 2 people sat down and were honest about what they wanted and then went out and got it. I will carry that until I can't carry anything at all.